Hello and welcome to NatStrat Conversations. My name is Pankaj Saran and I welcome you to this particular episode where we have with us a very special guest, Mr. Stanly Johny. He is the International Affairs Editor of the Hindu newspaper and has been an avid watcher of geopolitics for many, many years. He's a graduate of the Jawaharlal Nehru University and, more interestingly, is an author of two books which we will discuss today. The first is The ISIS Caliphate, From Syria to the Doorsteps of India, which he wrote in 2018, and a more recent book called Comrades and Mullahs, about China, Afghanistan, and the new geopolitics of the region. So we will discuss these books and much more on West Asia, which is a topic of current relevance and has not actually been discussed very much in the Indian strategic circles. Welcome to this show, and Stanley, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks, Ambassador. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. But let me begin by asking you, is the caliphate idea, which you talked about in 2018, would you say that it is past its prime, or is it still as current and vibrant as it was at the time when you wrote that book?
I think it has... as at least when we discuss this now, I think it has lost its lure now because West Asia, I think, has undergone a lot of changes ever since. And Caliphate has lost its physical structure in West Asia. And most of the territories that they were controlling when I wrote this in 2018, so they were still controlling vast swaths of territories in Syria and in Iraq. So they lost those territories. But at the same time, what you can see now is that, in Afghanistan, in eastern Afghanistan, they have established a very strong presence and they don't control territories as they had. So from 2014 to 2018, they had a proto-state across the borders of Syria and Iraq. Mm-hmm. Right now, the proto-state is gone. But now the ISIS is existing as a terrorist entity, just as a terrorist entity, not as a proto-state. Yeah. So in that capacity, I think they still control some powers in Afghanistan, eastern Afghanistan, and they have demonstrated their capability to carry out attacks inside Afghanistan and also in Syria, especially in the last couple of years. That capacity is growing. Mm-hmm. So we can say, compared to 2014 to 2018, mm-hmm. they have suffered a lot of losses, but they are not out yet. Yeah. They're there.
But it's interesting. I mean, a lot of this was born from the US invasions and interventions. Yeah. I mean, starting from, let's say, the whole decade, which we call as the decade of the fight against Islamic terrorism, yeah. Starting from 2001, yeah. The 9/11 attacks, yeah. And the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, and then the destabilization in Syria. So you had this almost a decade where you saw the birth not only of the Al-Qaeda, yeah. but then transforming itself into the ISIL and the ISIS. And I was just looking at the persona that were involved. It's extraordinary. Osama bin Laden was a Saudi. Zawahiri was an Egyptian. Zarqawi was a Jordanian. Right. And Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was an Iraqi. So you had four nationalities and four incarnations. And of course, the caliphate, as you said, probably doesn't exist. But looking back, the fact that these interventions and these invasions actually gave rise to the whole caliphate issue, right. Isn't that an extraordinary historical development?
That's correct. I mean, in the first book, ISIS Caliphate, while I was trying to trace the roots of the Islamic State, and I go back to the 2003 American invasion of Iraq. Because, see, Saddam Hussein, of course, we all know that Saddam Hussein had a lot of problems. But you must be recalling Colin Powell telling the United Nations back in 2002 about Saddam Hussein's connections with Al-Qaeda. Weapons of mass destruction was one thing, but he was also accusing Saddam Hussein of harboring Al-Qaeda, whereas Al-Qaeda had not had any presence in Iraq at that time. So you go to Iraq, you destroy the state, and you leave a vacuum, pushing the country into anarchy. And that, Zarqawi was going to exploit that vacuum. And then Al-Qaeda of Iraq. Actually, Al-Qaeda of Iraq was established in the post-Saddam vacuum in Iraq. And it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, that transformed into the Islamic State of Iraq. And Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was Zarqawi's successor. So Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he was basically Al-Qaeda in Iraq was pushed back to the corner by the Sunnis in Iraq, Sunnis themselves in Iraq. And then he finds an opportunity when Syria falls into crisis. So he sent his man, Abu Bakr al-Jawlani, Muhammad al-Jawlani, across the border to set up an Al-Qaeda unit in Syria. And it was basically Jabhat al-Nusra with Jawlani established in Syria that transformed into Al-Qaeda, that transformed into the Islamic State, the ISIS. But the fun fact is that ISIS was, as we discussed earlier, the physical caliphate was destroyed, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. Everybody was against ISIS. But the man Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi sent to Syria is still there in Syria. He is controlling Idlib. So he changed the name of his organization, which is because Jabhat al-Nusra was the official arm of Al-Qaeda. He changed the name of the organization into Hayat al-Sham. So he only rechristened the organization, but in content, Hayat al-Sham is the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda. And Hayat al-Sham is controlling territory now in Idlib, which is not in the control of the Syrian government. But apparently nobody is bothered about it now. So for the last 10 years, basically, they have established a presence in Syria. So it all begins from the Iraq War, basically the destruction of the states, the instability that followed.
So this is a great lesson in history as to what is the consequence of an action that you take and what is the aftermath. And you actually have created a caliphate, and you have actually also increased Iran's footprint. Something that you did has landed up in an even bigger problem. And of course, then as you trace in your subsequent books, gradually, as you said, it's spreading eastward into Afghanistan. Is there a successor ideology to ISIS and to the Islamic State or to the Caliphate?
So yes, the ideology of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, I think that ideology remains strong in these territories, in these regions. And see, jihadists love chaos, as we all know. So in 2013 to 2014, when the whole region was falling into chaos, they exploited this, and then they built their own networks. And now what they are trying to do is to do the same thing again and again, because now West Asia is again facing a lot of crisis. Now, the crisis that began with Hamas's October 7 attack against Israel, that is now snowballing into a region-wide crisis.
I would like to spend a little time on the history before we come to the current. 2010, 11, 12 was the so-called Arab Spring. There was nothing very happy about it because we saw the collapse of successive Arab regimes and then this emergence of the Caliphate and this ideology. We saw radical Shiite movements and the domination. And now what we find is that Assad is back in control in Syria. And in fact, the Russian and to an extent the American operations in Syria managed to actually defeat ISIS in Syria. So today we have Assad back in the seat, trying to bring order and restore the destruction in Syria. So that was happening at one level also, isn't it?
See, you made an interesting point when you talked about Iran while discussing the historical context of this crisis. The Americans went to Iraq, pulled down Saddam Hussein, who was a buffer actually between the Sunni Arabs and Iranians. Pulled down Saddam Hussein and brought democracy in Iraq, which actually turned the country into the hands of the Shia parties, letting Iran expand its influence in the region. It also enhanced the resentment among the Sunni community, which the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda tried to exploit. And then let's talk about the Arab Spring. This is what happened in Iraq. And in Arab Spring, the interesting point is that, okay, in Egypt, Mubarak fell and they had a transition government in between, an elected government, but Sisi came back to power. But in Syria and Libya, the United States and Libya went to liberate Libyans from Muammar Gaddafi, threw the country into chaos. Now Libya has multiple governments, multiple parliaments, and different, militia groups fighting each other. And we are talking about one of the most stable countries in North Africa. So that state was completely destroyed in Libya. So this happened in Obama's first term. I think later Obama himself realized that his policy towards Syria could backfire because Assad was basically turned to a corner, and there were different factions, like you had Al-Qaeda, you had the Islamic State, you had Free Syrian Army, which was supported by the Turks, and then CIA had a clandestine operation based in Jordan, which Trump himself had admitted once he became president. So everybody was working to unseat Bashar al-Assad, and the state was being eroded, if I use Putin's word. He wanted the state to be restored in Syria. So I think at some point of time, they realized that if this continues, which means Syria is going to be, then, I mean, if the jihadists take over Damascus, which is historically a very significant city, that would be complete, utter chaos. So that's where the Russians come in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, he went in December 2015.
Yeah.
He announced it in the UN General Assembly, and that's when the Russians got in militarily in Syria.
Yes.
And then they worked, actually, interestingly, with both the Iranians and the Israelis when their operations were underway in Syria. And obviously, those succeeded in pushing back the ISIS.
Yes.
And today, as you said, Bashar al-Assad is back very much.
Yeah.
But now I also want to ask you, when you talked about the Caliphate, you had a chapter, coming back a little bit, on the impact on India.
Yeah.
And here I wanted to ask, and you've done some studies, particularly in Kerala. Can you tell us a little bit about your findings about the impact of the ISIS in India, particularly in Kerala and Kasaragod and other districts? And what is your feedback from your investigations?
So, I reported immediately after this, 20 plus people left Kerala to join the Islamic State. Most of them went to Afghanistan. So I went and met their families. I also went and talked to the local community, religious leaders. So most of them, so these 21 people that include their wives and children. So most of the men who took them, took their whole families out of Kerala. Interestingly, most of them are from upper middle class families. So I found that this whole theory about poverty breeds extremism, I found it inconsistent. Most of them are from upper middle class families, and they were not really involved with the local communities. Local is, because in Kerala you see there are different Islamic communities. In a sense, mostly Sunni. It's near total 100% Sunni, but
which are the districts in Kerala which are most in the eye of the storm, so to say?
So, Malappuram is where you have majority Muslim community, but then Calicut and Kasaragod also. So one of them came from Palakkad. So if you look at the 21 people, they are from different states of the northern, center to northern states of Kerala. So, and then secondly, they were not really part of the local Muslim community. So you had two different Sunni groups in Kerala, and then you have the Mujahideen. So the Mujahideen are basically the literist interpretations. They believe in the literal interpretation of Islam, but basically they follow their own very strict Islamic life. And then you have Jamaat Islami, which is a political Islamist group. But these men, they were basically radicalized, or they were drawn into the idea of Islamic State through online propaganda. So at that time, there were even Malayalam blogs published by pro-Islamic State members, and they were asking Muslims in Kerala to do their hijrah, their religious journey from Kerala to the Caliphate. Their main argument, in the annex I had translated and published some of the blog posts in the book. So their argument was that you now have a caliphate. So as a Muslim, it is your responsibility to live in the caliphate, because this is a land of kafir. Kerala is a land of kafir. So it is interesting. I talked to some of the parents, and then they saw how their sons transformed from one day this guy came and cut the cable connection at home, saying that cable is anti-Islamic. So they were all mainly radicalized by online propaganda. And ISIS at that time, I think, was spending a lot of energy on internet propaganda. They were publishing articles in different languages, including in Malayalam, trying to reach out to Muslim youth.
So clearly, what happens, let's say, far away affects us. I mean, it's so obvious, this linkage.
Yes, yeah.
But has that mood changed now? I mean...
Yes, I think this was a small group, basically. So most of the mainstream communities in Kerala, they had all come out against this. And I personally know that in mosques, the imams would give the sermons against the Islamic State, actually condemning those who left Kerala and telling the youth, the pious youth, that this is not the Islamic way. This is basically a very violent interpretation of Islam. Yeah. So if you look at the mainstream Islamic preachers in Kerala and mainstream organizations in Kerala, they at that time they had all taken very strong position against the Islamic State and this idea of caliphate. And also the Islamic State, they managed to attract people, some Muslim youth, which they did from across the world, including from France, UK, Netherlands. Thousands of men had traveled to Syria, and the Turkish-Syrian border at that time was porous, if not open. And then some of them went to Afghanistan as well. But beyond this group, I don't think in Kerala they managed to build any major influence, ISIS as such.
What do you see in terms of how, let's say, the Indian Muslim is approaching this whole business of the caliphate?
So I think there is a clear ideological distinction between the Islam that is practiced in India and the Islamic State kind of Islam. But this Islamic State is ideologically it is a Wahhabist group. Yeah. And their Wahhabism is also different from even from the Saudi Wahhabism, I would say, because this is Wahhabi, we call it Wahhabi Islamism or Wahhabi Jihadism. So Wahhabism itself is the literal interpretation of Islam, and what Islamic State says that this is the only way of Islam. And if you don't follow this particular version of Islam, you are a kafir. And what they call, they make them takfiris, because if you are not following my version of Islam, you are not a true Muslim. And if you are not a true Muslim, I can harm you. Yeah. That's why most of the victims of the Islamic State are Muslims of Iraq and Syria. So I think that brand of Islam, literal interpretation of Islam, I think that is different from the branch of Islam that is practiced mainly in India. Yeah. That's also the reason I think they are not able to make any major inroads into India, despite India being one of the largest Muslim communities here.
Now, in the midst of all this, what is most interesting is that the Palestinian question had gone out of the kind of sentiment and the headlines in the region because we were dealing with a very different set of issues. What is your assessment and how do you see current state of issues and affairs on Gaza and the future of the Hamas and the future of Gaza?
It is, if we discuss the pre-October 7 West Asia, it's interesting that a lot of changes were undergoing in the region. Like you had the Abraham Accords. The Arabs and the Israelis were coming together. Saudi Crown Prince himself had said that they were making advances almost on a daily basis in their reconciliation bid with the Israelis. So we were witnessing some major changes in the region, and both sides, both Israelis and the Arabs, were willing to sidestep the Palestinian issue because Israel wanted to manage Palestine as an internal problem, and Arabs were ready to sidestep that issue for bilateral cooperation with Israel. This was the pre-October 7 reality. I think that clock has been now set backwards. Now it is difficult for the Arabs and also other players in the region to overlook the whole Palestine issue after both the Hamas attack, the October 7 attack, in which 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, were killed, and also the violence that followed, in which 30,000 Palestinians were killed by the Israelis. So that is one thing. And then secondly, you asked about the future of Hamas and the future of the Palestine question. So Israel is clearly facing some kind of major challenges here because on the one side, Israel wants to destroy Hamas, as Prime Minister Netanyahu himself had said, because Hamas carried out the biggest attack in Israel's history by a non-state actor. But at the same time, Hamas is also, it has become part of the Palestinian society. So how do you destroy that kind of an organization? This is a challenge the Israelis are also facing now. So what the Americans are, I think, trying to do now is, when they talk about a post-war situation, they want to bring in the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, PLO, or the Palestinian actors which are much more acceptable to the international community, let them come and take over, or at least have some kind of civil administration in Gaza in a post-war situation, and then push both sides to start negotiations, trying to find some kind of, at least a pause to the conflict. But the question on what to do with Hamas would still be there. I think there is no answer to this question as of now.
And there is also no ready answer to what happens in Gaza and what kind of a two-state solution you can actually realistically achieve. I mean, right now it's in the realm of just rhetoric and aspiration.
Yeah, clearly. Netanyahu has clearly said in his post-war plan that he wants to maintain some kind of a security presence in Gaza. And I think IDF is also now building no man's land along Israel's border with Gaza, basically bringing down all the infrastructure, all the buildings, and then creating some kind of a buffer zone so that there won't be any more October 7 kind of attack. So which means even Gaza Strip, where 2.3 million people are living, won't be the same Gaza Strip. Israeli troops would be there, and Israeli buffer zone would be there. And if you're talking about a two-state solution, so you have the Israeli state. So if you want to have a two-state solution, you need to have a Palestinian state. And if you want to have a Palestinian state, that state should have a border. That state should have a capital. That state should have sovereignty. And I don't foresee any of this coming.
Yeah. In the past, repeated and successive US administrations, starting from the president himself, have invested hugely. We remember the Madrid Peace Conference, Oslo, and the whole litany of efforts, starting from President Bill Clinton, etc. How do you rate the chances of the current US administration or its future administration being able to succeed in finding any kind of a solution beyond just a ceasefire?
I think the chances are near zero. That's one thing. Secondly, the question is whether the current US administration or even the next administration, whether it is Biden or the Trump administration, would be genuinely wanting to push for a solution. Because I think Biden's policy towards this whole crisis in West Asia, it doesn't make a strategic sense to me when I look at it from outside. Because Biden says he supports a two-state solution. But if you support a two-state solution, how can you support the settlements in the West Bank? Because you need to talk about the border. For example, if you look at India's position, India says it supports two-state solution, but at the UN, India votes against the settlements. So there is some kind of a continuity in what you say and what you do at the UN. And India says that it opposes Israel's continuing occupation of Golan Heights. And India says it supports the Palestinian right to self-determination. If you look at India's voting record, most recent voting records, but the United States is voting against all these resolutions while it says that it supports two-state solution. So it doesn't actually make sense. And then secondly, even when Biden came to power, he said that commitment to human rights would be the cornerstone of his foreign policy. But Biden hasn't even supported the call for a ceasefire. Everybody else is calling for a ceasefire. So the UN General Assembly, UN Security Council is not able to pass a resolution calling for a ceasefire because of the United States veto. Even France calls for a ceasefire. Britain is abstaining. They are not backing the continuation of the war. British Prime Minister is calling for a humanitarian pause. India is supporting a ceasefire. China is supporting a ceasefire. So the US policy, I think, is not very coherent here. So the question is whether the Biden administration actually wants to push for a two-state solution. So I don't see clarity in America's position.
What I was told was that the US is very keen to ensure that this war does not spill out of control and engulf either the US itself or other states. And that's why they are trying to put maximum pressure on Netanyahu to contain the fallout. But of course, I agree with what you have said. But now, shifting a little bit to Afghanistan. And you mentioned briefly about the Islamic State of Khorasan and eastern Afghanistan and its new manifestation. And then very interestingly, you talk about in the book on Comrades and Mullahs about how Afghanistan has been actually the graveyard for all superpowers and major powers. Have you done any study on how the current Taliban regime conducting itself and is faring in terms of governance?
We have an interesting theory in the book. So the Taliban, last time when they came to power in 1996, they were pulled out of power in 2001, not because of their governance problems or domestic issues. It is because of their connections with Al-Qaeda, their external relations. So this time, when the Taliban, when they started holding negotiations with the United States, one of their early proposals to the Americans was that we will sever ties with Al-Qaeda. You don't mess with what we are doing internally. And the Biden administration accepted it. The Taliban said, we will have talks with you, not with the Afghan government. Trump administration. And the Americans said, fine. Do not bring the Afghan government into it. So we will have talks directly with you. So the Americans and the Taliban, they held multiple rounds of talks in Doha. And Trump administration appointed Ambassador Salman Khalilzad as the special envoy. And they also agreed an agreement. And in the agreement, there was no ceasefire. So what the Taliban promised was that we won't attack the Americans. We won't attack the foreign troops, but we will continue to attack the Afghan government and the Afghan troops. And NATO was okay with that. So they had the agreement, and the American troops were out of Afghanistan. And before, basically 15 days ahead of the American troops withdrawal, the Taliban were back in power. So now the Taliban, we wrote the book, this book was out a couple of years ago. But you see, Taliban's main proposal is that it remains the same. What they tell the Americans, what they tell the Chinese, is that we will manage the domestic issues. We won't let Afghan soil to be used by groups that are inimical towards your interests. But let us run the country as we please. So, as we discussed now, Taliban came to power in 2020, 2021, August 15. Women are still not going to college in Afghanistan. Schools are still shut for girls. And women are not allowed to go to work. So the whole narrative about Taliban 2.0, which you witnessed mostly in Western media when the talks were going on between Taliban and the Americans, there was nothing actually.
Yeah. So obviously the whole Afghanistan situation was overshadowed by Ukraine, this happened in August 2021, Ukraine happened in February 2022. So the headlines were hogged by Afghanistan for barely 6 months. After that, it's completely disappeared from consciousness. So effectively, the Taliban have been so far busy consolidating internally and settling scores, it seems, with Pakistan through the TTP. Where does Pakistan fit into this whole equation and this puzzle? How do you read them?
So Pakistan has Islamic State. Actually, Islamic State of Khorasan had established a branch across the border in the Pakistani territories as well. But at the same time, I think Pakistan, it is very, it's very complex and convoluted when it comes to this different Islamic groups. Because the Deobandi version of Islam, which mostly the Taliban follow, that is very strong, very powerful along the border regions. So in Pakistan, if you look at today's Pakistan, so the most powerful radical Islamist group is the Pakistani Taliban. So not the ISIS branch. So those who were influenced by the ISIS kind of ideology, so they had already joined the Islamic State Khorasan in eastern Afghanistan. So the difference between Pakistan Taliban and Islamic State, of course, is that Islamic State wants to make Afghanistan and Pakistan as two branches of their idea of global caliphate. Whereas the Pakistani Taliban wants to do in Pakistan what Afghan Taliban did in Afghanistan. They want to turn Pakistan into an Islamic emirate. So there are ideological differences between these two groups.
These are big differences. These are fundamental differences. And of course, there is this Pashtun layover also as part of the whole Taliban movement, on both sides of the Durand line.
Exactly.
So finally, what I want to then talk to you about is how do you then look to the future, and do you think the Hamas conflict or the Gaza conflict, which is underway today, could unravel everything that we have achieved so far in terms of normalization? I mean, is the Palestinian issue, obviously it's back center stage today, But when you look at the way the Arabs and the Gulf states are approaching it, how worried are you, or in your analysis which you follow, about further deterioration before things become better?
I think the Arab-Israel normalization is now on hold because Saudi Arabia is not going to recognize Israel in the near future unless there is some kind of a breakthrough in Israel-Palestinian relationship. Saudi Foreign Ministry has repeatedly said that. Even if the Saudis wanted to do this, I think their hands would be tied because internally the public opinion has overwhelmingly turned against Israel, not only in Saudi Arabia but also in other Arab countries. So the Arab monarchs or other Arab presidents, it would be impossible for them to ignore this sentiment. That is one thing. But it doesn't mean that normalization would not happen in the future. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that at least for the time being, it's on hold. That's one thing. Secondly, the crisis has already spread beyond the borders. It's now not just about Israel and Hamas. It's also about Houthis. It's also about Iran. It's also about the Americans. So it's also about the Shia mobilization units in Iraq and Syria. So how to contain this is another question. So I think to contain this crisis, you need to begin with a ceasefire. So that has to begin in Gaza. So the situation is now, basically West Asia is now in flux. And this, especially with regard to Israel and Palestine, I think once the dust settles, the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Americans and other powers, they all will face this question. You know better, after a conflict, all the stakeholders will face a question, what you should do to avoid this happening again. So I think there, at that point, they may have to come together, start a serious diplomatic process. This is what the Israelis did after Yom Kippur War, which led to the Camp David Agreement. So as of now, the process is painful. But I think eventually all the stakeholders will face this critical question on what they should be doing.
And as an outsider observer, anything you would like to say about what India should be doing?
So if you ask me, I think India continues to do its very delicate balancing act because on the one side, Israel is your partner. Israel is a major defense partner. And on the other side, you see that the way Israel is conducting the war is actually raising a lot of global criticism. And you are a major global South player. And in the global South, there are countries who are taking very strong moral position. And it is in your interest that this war is brought to an end. It is not in your interest that the war continues unended. So I think what India is trying to do is that without, like in the case of Russia, we usually don't do the name calling. We take our positions. So without actually blaming any actors, we are actually saying that we support two-state solution. We are against settlements. We support the Palestinian right to self-determination, and we also want a ceasefire. So I think India has articulated that position well.
So I think we are in a definitely much better position to play a role than we were in the past. Not least because of the fact that we have much better ties with every single actor in that region, including, of course, with the United States. So I think we are much better positioned to do this. Let's hope that the situation is brought under control and does not escalate first. We have already got the Ukrainian front to deal with, and now this is the additional front. And in my view, I think this is a far more serious front insofar as India is concerned, because it's much closer, and you can see the Indian Navy deployed and everything else in Yemen, and the whole return of non-state actors and threatening our sea lines of communication, trade routes. These are all real issues for us. So thank you so much, Stanley, for joining us, and it's a great pleasure, and thanks for your time and your insights, and I hope you will continue to write and follow this highly complicated region. But it's wonderful, and I hope that people who watch this show will be inspired by his scholarship, and it will encourage younger scholars in India to study West Asia. Thank you so much, Stanley.
Thank you, Ambassador. Pleasure is mine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode of NatStrat Conversations with Stanley Johny, International Affairs Editor of the Hindu newspaper. We will come back with more episodes, but thank you so much for joining. Namaskar.